A ghoul, by definition, is a nightmarish fictional creature who takes pleasure in performing unthinkable acts of corpse desecration, a perverse preoccupation which usually culminates in the practice of necrophilia or cannibalism. Ghouls have long been a standby element in the realm of horror films, never failing to shock an audience with their unholy habits. Given this perception, it is difficult to believe that the real world could produce a faithful counterpart with every sordid desire intact. Yet there exists in the annals of true crime two men who, by the nature of their despicable deeds, have proven worthy of the unique and ghastly label of ghoul. Edward Gein and John Wayne Gacy. While their names may not be as familiar as those of Charles Manson, Richard Speck, or Ted Bundy, these two murderous Midwesterners have combined to carve the most twisted, horrific, and spine-tingling legacy in the history of modern crime. Edward Gein was born on August 8, 1906, was brought up in a strict religious household, and was taught from an early age that hard work was the ultimate virtue, and that women were the supreme pariahs of sin. Gein's father was a farmer and part-time tanner who moved the family to Plainfield, Wisconsin, and began working sun-up to sundown on his 160-acre field, leaving Edward's mother to become the seminal influence on his developing years. She taught Edward, among other things, that God was planning to destroy the world because women wore lipstick. She also insisted that Edward and his brother Henry never marry, instilling in both an irrational hatred of what she termed scarlet women. As a result, Gein's view of the opposite sex and his own nascent sexuality was irrevocably twisted and confused. From an early age, in fact, he had fantasies of becoming a woman. He even considered amputating his penis on several occasions to achieve this end. Edward was 36 when his father died in 1940, and 4 years later, a Wisconsin forest fire claimed the life of brother Henry. But Gein's mother battled 2 strokes before finally succumbing in 1945, leaving her son to tend to the farm all by himself. As the rest of the country celebrated the Allies' victory in World War II, Edward did something else entirely. Gein found the corpse so sexually stimulating that he ended up eating parts of the body and making a waistcoat of the skin so he could wear it and become a woman whenever he wanted to. The highly publicized case of transsexual Christine Jorgensen no doubt inspired Gein to seek this tangible, albeit psychotic, process with which to satiate his inner longings. But Gein's accompanying cannibalistic tendencies soon necessitated the continued acquisition of fresh female cadavers. Gein began seeking odd jobs around Plainfield, and soon teamed up with a dim-witted local farmer named Gus to grave rob after hours. Utilizing 3 local cemeteries, the fiendish duo opened an estimated 9 or 10 graves in their nocturnal raids. Often they would remove whole corpses, sometimes just bits and pieces. Gein told Gus that the female bodies they exhumed were needed for at-home experiments, and the older man obligingly helped Ed transport the corpses to a small shed on the Gein farm. Gus never knew what Gein did with the bodies, never asked, and never could have imagined the chillingly demented truth. Alone with a fresh new female corpse, Gein would first skin it and purposefully proceed to fashion a familiarly sickening vest of female flesh, complete with breasts and genitalia to wear over his own. Gein would then take the remaining body parts and, recalling his father's part-time tanning trade, create lampshades and wastebaskets out of human skin. But Gein's ghoulish imagination wouldn't stop there. He created knives with handles of human bone, bowls made from inverted skull caps, and would utilize the remaining shards of human skin to upholster his kitchen chairs. After Gus was taken away to an old folks' home, Gein continued grave robbing on his own. But his increased appetite for human flesh, coupled with his growing inner torments, soon led him to scrutinize the living and covet their prized bodily parts. On December 8, 1954, Gein walked into a deserted saloon in Pine Grove, Wisconsin, pulled out a .22 caliber pistol and, without a word, shot 51-year-old bartender Mary Hogan in the head. He then dragged her lifeless form back to his farm, added her to his gruesome collection of victims, and literally cannibalized the remainder of her body for good measure. In search of his next victim, Gein walked into a Plainfield hardware store one day in November 1957. Standing behind the counter was the store's proprietor, 58-year-old Bernice Warden, talking with her son Frank, who was the town's deputy sheriff. Ed spent the next week stopping in at the hardware store, talking to both Bernice and Frank about the particulars of antifreeze, and in the process learned that Frank's deer hunting excursion was the following Saturday morning. At that time, with Bernice Warden alone in the store, Gein made his move. Walking over to a gun display, he pulled a .22 caliber rifle from the rack and inserted a single cartridge which he'd brought for this purpose. He then fired upon Bernice Warden, shooting her dead. When Frank Warden returned from his hunting trip, he found the hardware store locked. After breaking in, he not only discovered the cash register missing, but noticed disturbing traces of blood on the floor and a written receipt for antifreeze. Acting on the hunch, Warden went directly to the Gein farm. When he saw the farmhouse empty, he looked into the shed and discovered the naked, headless, disemboweled corpse of his mother hanging upside down from the rafters. The body had been dressed like a carcass in a butcher shop. Stunned, Warden and other Plainfield police authorities tracked Gein down and finally learned the grisly truth about the literal house of horrors that Edward Gein called home. Gaining entrance to the farmhouse at last, they discovered the most horrifying collection of artifacts any of them had ever seen. Gein's collection of skins in a cardboard box. Bernice Warden's severed head in another. A human heart and a frying pan on the stove waiting to be eaten. A tom-tom made from a coffee can and human skin. 9 death masks, all of women, with portions of hair and scalp intact, and several of his infamous waistcoats. All told, the gruesome remains added up to at least 15 bodies. Arrested and formally charged with murder, Gein confessed to the 2 killings, acknowledged his instances of body snatching, but defiantly insisted that he wasn't a robber. "I took that cash register," he explained, "because I wanted to see how it worked." On January 16, 1958, a judge found Gein criminally insane. He was immediately sent to Central State Hospital in Waupun, Wisconsin. A full decade later, in November 1968, Gein's case was ordered up for trial. Judge Robert Goldmar found Gein innocent by reason of insanity and returned him to the insane asylum. But Gein's legacy continued on. Local teens began to swap tasteless Ed Gein jokes, which soon swept the country. On March 30th, 1958, an auction of Ed Gein's less ghoulish possessions took place. But when suggestions of turning the property into a macabre tourist attraction were heard, the Gein farm soon mysteriously burned to the ground. Though Ed Gein died in 1984, his horrific habits have been immortalized time and again in motion pictures, some of which have become classics of the horror genre.
This young man, you had to feel sorry for him. After all, being dominated by an almost maniacal woman was enough to drive anyone to the extreme of, well, let's go in. Well, they've cleaned all this up now. Big difference. You should have seen the blood. The whole place was, well, it's too horrible to describe. Dreadful. And I'll tell you, there's a very important clue was found here. Down there. Well, the murderer, you see, crept in here very slowly. Of course, the shower was on, there was no sound, and
what happened was true. Well, this article here covers quite a bit of it, and of course tells a lot of the facts. The bizarre truth behind the man who inspired Psycho and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I mean, they've got some photos in here how he made, what he made the skin, what he did with the skin. Oh, it is weird, I'll tell you. I remember, living in Chicago. I remember hearing about it when it happened back in '57. He died here in '84 at the Mendota Mental Hospital, because he lived up in Wisconsin there.
It is perhaps more than a mere coincidence that the only man in criminal history whose twisted deeds are comparable to those of Ed Gein would harbor an intense fascination with the Gein saga. Yet John Wayne Gacy would go on to achieve the ultimate ghoulish goal by maintaining a well-stocked personal graveyard beneath the floorboards of his suburban home. John Wayne Gacy was born on March 17, 1942 in Chicago, and grew up amidst an incendiary family atmosphere of anger, fear, and outright violence. His father, a Polish immigrant, was an out-of-control alcoholic whose frustrations and disappointments with life seemed to find their only outlet in abuse toward his child. Gacy Jr. retreated into a world of physical and psychological hypochondria, constantly complaining of stomach pains and heart palpitations. Here, John Gacy reflects on his difficult Chicago childhood.
Well, I know you can always heal old wounds. I know with my dad, I never got along with him while he was alive. I never could please him. And of course, with him drinking and his Jekyll and Hyde routine, when he drank, he was a son of a bitch. And I just kind of stayed away from it as much as possible. But he always said you'd never amount to anything, and you're dumb and stupid and all that, So I went out and made my own way. But he died at the age of 69. Of course, I had older parents, too. My dad was almost 40 when he got married. He was 38. My mother was 30 when they got married. So you can tell there's a great gap in age difference. My dad was 40 years older than I was. So it's hard to sometimes relate to that, especially he come from the old country. From Poland, and headstrong. Just didn't argue with him.
After completing high school, Gacy went to business college, graduated to take a job at a shoe store, and out to prove his father wrong, quickly established himself as one of the hardest working shoe salesmen in the operation. But Gacy's stunted psychological growth continually fueled a desperate inner need to be liked and appreciated. In addition, Gacy was a habitual liar, constantly boasting of his physical and mental abilities in a hopeless attempt to erase the debilitating effects of John Gacy Sr.'s criticisms from his memory. Although his personal psychology was relatively unhealthy, Gacy nevertheless convinced one of his co-workers, a young woman from Waterloo, Iowa, to marry him. Shortly thereafter, Gacy and his new wife moved to the small Iowa town where Gacy took the reins of his in-laws' family business, a modest fried chicken establishment, and started raising a family, a son and a daughter. Gacy instantly won the admiration of his Iowa business peers with his no-nonsense approach to business, putting in long hours and contributing his time and money to the Junior Chamber of Commerce. But Gacy's hard-won image of conscientiousness and normality was shattered completely in May of 1968, when he was arrested by local police for coercing one of his teenage restaurant employees to perform homosexual acts with him. When the charges appeared to be backed by substantial evidence, Gacy hired a youthful ne'er-do-well to attack the prosecution's star witness, but the plan backfired, and Gacy was additionally charged with obstruction of justice. Sent to an Iowa penitentiary on a 10-year sentence, Gacy saw his marriage fall apart while behind bars. But he vowed to amend his criminal actions by becoming a model prisoner, and was rewarded with a release from prison a short 18 months after his conviction. Moving back to Chicago, where his criminal record would be less conspicuous, Gacy again put his nose to the grindstone, immersing himself in one business venture after another, before finally settling upon the lucrative building contracting trade. In 1972, Gacy repeated the pattern of his pre-criminal past, winning the heart of a young Chicago woman with his pragmatic outlook on life and his responsible work ethic. Marrying her, Gacy relocated to the suburbs of Chicago and again attempted to embrace the normal middle-class lifestyle that he'd always dreamed about. His aggressive gregariousness earned him the friendship of many of his neighbors and brought him a measure of celebrity when he'd put on colorful makeup, don a frilly costume, and entertain children's birthday parties as the wisecracking Pogo the Clown. But while his outward appearance was that of a straight-arrow member of the community, Gacy's complex and powerful inner urges would not be stifled. In 1972, Gacy began to prowl the gay district of Chicago on the nights his wife was away. He then lured young men to his suburban home with offers of free beer, magic demonstrations, and friendly games of pool. At a strategic point in the evening, Gacy would produce a pair of trick handcuffs, which he fastened and removed with ease. But when his guests playfully tried them on, they locked tight, and Gacy would expediently render his hapless prey unconscious and sexually assault him. Now driven by fear of being reported and once again imprisoned, Gacy would strangle the life from each subdued victim and bury them in the dark, damp crawl space beneath his home. By the mid-1970s, Gacy's victims numbered in the dozens, while his daytime persona of affability led him further and further up the social ladder. Gacy endeared himself to the Chicago caucus of the Democratic Party, and he was even photographed in 1978 with then First Lady Rosalind Carter. But in his desperate desire to impress, Gacy often faltered, occasionally crossing the line into outright fabrication. At one point, he had cards printed up identifying himself as a Democratic precinct captain, when Gacy was merely an active supporter in the party. Gacy had also begun taking an assortment of recreational drugs, which caused an increasingly violent temperament. This, coupled with his dwindling interest in his wife's affection, resulted in divorce in 1976. Now Gacy's murderous appetite shifted into high gear. His victims, once mostly streetwise hustlers, now included several teenagers who had worked for him. In a 2-month span in spring alone, at least 5 boys were sodomized, tortured, and murdered in Gacy's suburban house of horrors. When guests would complain about the rancid odor which emanated from the floor of the dwelling, Gacy would casually state that it was probably due to faulty plumbing. By October, the seeping crawl space was filled to overcapacity. Then on December 12, 1978, 15-year-old Robert Peast vanished from his Des Plaines, Illinois neighborhood after telling his mother that he was going to see a contractor about a summer job that paid $5 an hour. Alerted to the boy's disappearance, investigators noted that Gacy's construction firm had recently remodeled the drugstore where Peast had last been seen. Following up on the tip, Illinois police stopped by Gacy's home that evening to inquire about the case, and immediately noticed the foul stench emanating from beneath the structure's foundation. When they asked Gacy for an explanation, he gave them a rambling statement which aroused suspicion. Investigating further, authorities discovered the first of the crawl space bodies, kept on digging, and became more and more amazed, shocked, and disgusted at what they found. Discovering body after body, investigators leveled Gacy's home, tore up 2 driveways, and dismantled the garage in an attempt to completely catalog the wholesale carnage that Gacy had wrought. When they finally finished, 29 bodies were discovered on the property. 4 more were recovered from a nearby river, and John Wayne Gacy was arrested, charged, and convicted on all counts by a Cook County judge. Though Gacy sits on death row at the Menard Correctional Facility in Illinois, he is anything but an idle man, appearing tirelessly preoccupied with various methods of expression. He routinely corresponds with hundreds of persons, ranging from Christian ministers to well-known heavy metal musicians. In this pursuit, Gacy often displays his genius for manipulation, adapting the text of his letters to perfectly suit the personality of each reader. His replies can be tender and eloquent, with touches of sanctimonious self-pity, or coarse and mean-spirited, containing lewd poetry and pornographic cartoons. Despite the overwhelming evidence which convicted him, Gacy still maintains his innocence with a series of typed flyers he distributes by mail. He also wrote a mammoth autobiography entitled A Question of Doubt, which presents a cloudy string of alibis for the murders. However, no major publisher has deemed the rambling literary effort marketable in its present form. Perhaps more impressive is the craftsmanship Gacy displays in this fully articulated scale model of his now defunct murder house, constructed entirely from cigar boxes. But the one jailhouse venture from which John Gacy has achieved true notoriety is the sale of his sketches and paintings. Since announcing his entry into the field of art, Gacy has been commissioned to create graphics for everything from punk rock album jackets to illustration plates for books with extreme and unusual themes. Though fairly crude, Gacy's paintings have also proven quite popular as curios and conversation pieces, with many turning up in gallery shows nationwide. The notion that a sadistic killer could profit from his infamy created a firestorm of controversy in the press, with particular outrage expressed by the parents of Gacy's victims. A closer examination of Gacy's favorite art themes tend to reveal an often sardonic and cruel sense of humor on his part. One example being his Hi-Ho series, in which he depicts the classic Disney characters, the Seven Dwarfs, marching through a variety of settings. The grotesquely rendered figures, happily returning from a dark abyss, with digging tools in hand, readily conjures images of the hellish crawl space which housed Gacy's many victims. Several other paintings in the Gacy collection are more shamelessly ghoulish, while still others are wholesome, respectable images designed to attract the more serious and discerning art customer. Gacy's most popular paintings of all are his self-portraits, in which he appears as his infamous clown creations, Pogo and Patches. Psychologists agree that the makeups Gacy devised for these traditionally cheerful characters instead reveal a deep-seated desire to instill terror in children. The departure from the standard, well-rounded eye and mouth shadows actually give his clowns a grim, menacing quality, reminiscent of a grinning death's head. By always placing his painted clowns in a forest setting, Gacy also lends a telling predatory quality to these creations. In 1991, a new warden at Menard Prison issued an order officially disallowing Gacy's artwork to be sold from the facility. Yet interest in the crude paintings and horrible crimes of John Wayne Gacy continues, as do motion picture incarnations of Wisconsin cannibal Ed Gein. It appears most certain that the uniquely horrific legacies of the ghouls, Gein and Gacy, will long haunt all who bear witness to their bloody handiwork. Juan Vallejo Corona, Henry Lee Lucas, Charlie Starkweather, James Huberty, Charles Whitman, and David Berkowitz. Their names and faces may not be familiar, but the terrifying criminal episodes they've orchestrated, such as the McDonald's massacre, the Texas Tower assassinations, and the notorious Son of Sam killings, have sown some of the most gruesome and unforgettable chapters in the history of American law and order, making them textbook examples of mass murderers. While the impulse to kill has unquestionably been with man since the dawn of time, The origins of the phenomenon were never seriously examined until the 20th century, when the advent of modern psychology, coupled with nuts and bolts documentation of crime patterns and behavior, finally launched comprehensive study and analysis of the criminal mind. What emerged was a strictly defined distinction between the motive-driven psychology of the common murderer and the twisted extremes of the mass murderer and serial killer. While the serial killer, by definition, murders compulsively in the same way that a normal man would take a shower or change the oil in his car, the mass murderer's motivation to kill is a sudden, spontaneous eruption, often as a result of psychological trauma, which cannot be vented or quelled in any other way. What is common to both the serial killer and mass murderer psychologies is the utterly arbitrary manner with which they select their victims. For these uniquely bloodthirsty killers, the act of murder is of far more importance than the identity of the victim, as the case of Charlie Starkweather so dramatically reveals. Born in 1940, Starkweather grew up in the modest farming community of Lincoln, Nebraska. The uninspired environment of his childhood was compounded by the fact that he was bow-legged, wore glasses, and stood only 5'2" at the age of 17. In addition, Starkweather was constantly teased by schoolmates for his dark red hair, as well as his unapologetic emulation of James Dean, which combined to earn him the nickname Little Red. Desperately seeking to find his place in society, Starkweather dropped out of high school and found work as a garbage man in 1957. But his self-described black moods, coupled with his continuing James Dean obsession, resulted in unpredictable and violently antisocial behavior. Starkweather began carrying a rifle with him wherever he went, and habitually shouted curses to total strangers from his garbage truck. Starkweather's only solace was his relationship with 14-year-old Carol Ann Fugit, which quickly became threatened by the Fugit family's intense disapproval of the red-haired garbage man. On December 1st, 1957, Starkweather's inner frustration with the world finally became too much to bear. He spontaneously held up a gas station in Lincoln, abducted the 21-year-old attendant, and drove him out into the wheat fields to calmly murder him with a single shotgun blast. Starkweather's mental instability was energized by the senseless, motiveless killing, and 7 weeks later, he paid a visit to Carol Ann Fugit's home. Carol Ann wasn't at home, but her mother, Velda Bartlett, and her stepfather, Marion Bartlett, were. They got into an argument with Starkweather, demanding that he put away his .22 caliber hunting rifle. Starkweather responded by blasting both Velda and Marion to death. When Carol Ann later arrived home, she stood mutely by as Starkweather grabbed her 2-year-old sister, choked the child to death, and purposefully discarded the body in a cardboard box. Carol Ann then went to watch TV, as Starkweather made some sandwiches and posted a sign on the door saying, "Stay away, everybody is sick with the flu." After 6 days of turning away relatives and neighbors, suspicions were aroused, and the pair fled in Starkweather's car. When the vehicle became stuck in the mud only miles from Carol's home, Starkweather walked to the nearby farm of an elderly hunting companion, August Meyer, and upon sight of the man, gunned him down in cold blood. Starkweather and Fugit then robbed the farmhouse of guns and money and struck out on foot for the nearest highway. While hitchhiking, they were picked up by a pair of local teens, Robert Jensen and Carol King. Starkweather pulled a gun on the couple and directed them back to the Meyer farm, where they were led to an abandoned storm cellar. While Fugit remained in the car, Starkweather shot Jensen 6 times in the head and then raped and butchered Carol King. Desiring a change of pace, Starkweather drove to a huge estate he had seen on his garbage route, the home of wealthy Lincoln industrialist C. Lauer Ward. There, the young Starkweather engaged in yet another cruel, murderous spree of stabbing and shooting, which claimed the lives of Ward, his wife Clara, and their housekeeper. By this time, the police had been called to investigate the mysterious quiet at Carol Fugit's home and found the bodies of the 3 slain family members in 2 sheds behind the house. Suspecting Starkweather at once, law officers fanned out in the area, only to uncover the second massacre scene at the Meyer farm. The merciless, frenzied manner with which Starkweather had dispatched his victims sent a collective shudder throughout the community, and with the discovery of the Ward family slayings, officials realized that no one was safe from this mad dog killer. Local schools were closed, and the National Guard was summoned to aid in the search for Starkweather. Meanwhile, Charlie and Carol had stolen Ward's expensive Packard and headed for the state line. Fearing that the car was too conspicuous, Starkweather pulled over near Douglas, Wyoming, and hastily attempted to steal a parked car after killing the napping driver. Another motorist happened upon the spectacle and was soon engaged in a life-and-death struggle with the desperate killer. During the brawl, a sheriff's deputy pulled up, and before he could intervene, young Carol Ann, who till now had been a passive witness to the incident, suddenly ran screaming to the officer for help. With this, Starkweather bolted from the scene, and a high-speed chase ensued. When a police bullet shattered the rear window of Starkweather's car, he received a minor cut from a speck of flying glass. Fearing that he was mortally wounded, he immediately pulled over and was taken into custody. Officers were amazed at such a cowardly display from an otherwise cold and ruthless killer. Once news cameras appeared on the scene, Starkweather rallied, however, and began to faithfully project the defiant, cocksure manner of a restless teenage rebel. Initially, Starkweather declared to authorities that Carol Ann had nothing to do with the killings, but when the senseless rash of murders earned him a death sentence, he claimed instead that she had been a willing accomplice. Meanwhile, Carol Ann kept emphatically insisting that Starkweather had forced her to accompany him on the bloody murder spree by threatening to kill her family.
Did you ever break down and cry and beg Charlie to let you go or anything like that?
Yes, I cried all the way.
Now, did you go with him for quite a while?
Yes, I went with him the year before, and then I told him I didn't want to see him again, but he came back. And after that Sunday, I went with him, and then I kept telling him to leave. And that Sunday, I told him to leave, and I told him I didn't ever want to see him again.
Why, what had brought you to this conclusion? Why didn't you want to go with him anymore?
I think he's crazy.
Do you think that Charles got what he deserved when he was convicted to the electric chair?
That's not my place to say.
During the trial of Carol Fugate, defense lawyers continued to press home the notion that the 14-year-old was nothing more than an innocent hostage throughout the ordeal. However, jurors were made uncomfortable by Carol's completely cold and detached manner, and the revelation that she had held victims at bay prior to their executions. Starkweather's testimony was damaging as well, as he cited an incident at a roadside diner where Carol mused, "Those hamburgers were lousy. We ought to go back and shoot all them people in the restaurant." In the end, Carol received a guilty verdict and a life sentence for her part in the 11 slayings. Starkweather lamented the outcome by stating, "It's a shame. I would have liked to have had her sitting in my lap when they put me in the electric chair." The execution of Charles Starkweather took place at midnight in the Nebraska State Penitentiary on June 24th, 1959. Just prior to the event, Starkweather was asked if he would like to donate his eyes for transplant after death. True to his character, he sneered, "Hell no, no one ever did anything for me." Through the years, the little girl whose life was forever altered by a reckless, gun-wielding beast maintained her claims of innocence and was released from prison on parole in 1976. Though free from the confines of a concrete cell, she remains haunted by the nightmarish memories of that bloody week in January of 1958, when she and a monster named Starkweather carved a bloody path through the Nebraska Badlands. Unlike Charlie Starkweather, the hallmarks of Charles Whitman's childhood were intelligence and conformity. Born in 1941 and raised in Lake Worth, Florida, the mild-mannered Whitman was an Eagle Scout as a youth, a Marine in his teenage years, and still later, a straight-A student at the University of Texas at Austin. In 1966, the seemingly well-adjusted Charles became emotionally devastated when his domineering father walked out on the family. A pattern of violent outbursts and destructive behavior began, and Whitman withdrew into a world of alienation and incessant brooding. On August 1st, 1966, Whitman went on a well-planned rampage, first visiting his mother's apartment and taking her life, then proceeding to his own home where he stabbed his sleeping wife to death. Next, he meticulously loaded a footlocker with weapons and food and hauled the heavy arsenal to the 300-foot bell tower at the University of Texas. Making his way to the elevator, Whitman began shooting anyone who stood in his path, and within minutes had reached the observation deck, He then took a place in this ideal sniper's perch and, utilizing his skill as a military marksman, began a merciless assault on the unsuspecting citizens below.
This is a warning to the citizens of Austin. Stay away from the emergency area.
One of those who is out of breath now after running out onto the mall rescuing those who have been shot is Brian Ellison of Austin, who has been in Vietnam and has been back for 2 years. Brian, how many have you gone after rescue?
Today, 2.
What did you have to do?
Run hard and keep low.
Did you have any trouble getting them up, or did any shots come close to you while you were out there?
No shots came close to me. It's just the last one. He was dead. He was dead weight. He was a little hard to pick up, too limp. Not like someone who's knocked out.
How many have you seen that are dead today?
Just one. I hope not anymore.
After a siege of over 90 minutes, Whitman was still squeezing off round after deadly round, in spite of constant ground fire from pinned-down policemen below, and an ineffectual attempt to shoot him from overhead by a marksman in a small plane. At this point, Austin Patrolman Ramiro Martinez bravely led a small troop of officers to the stairwell of the tower. Once they had carefully gained access to the observation deck, they encountered Whitman head-on, and a volley of shots fell the 26-year-old gunman. In his murderous frenzy, Whitman had managed to kill 12 and wound over 30 innocent people. It was later determined that despite his having to constantly dodge return fire, he had struck a victim in 1 out of every 3 shots. The startling degree of mayhem caused by the Lone Tower gunman inspired police agencies nationwide to develop special weapons and tactics squads, called SWAT teams, to combat similar assaults by terrorists or mass killers. During an autopsy of Charles Whitman, coroners found a tumor in the hypothalamus region of his brain, but medical experts discounted its effect on his behavior. Later, Senator Ralph Yarborough would state that Whitman's actions were more likely the result of a long-term exposure to television violence. The terrifying scenario of a crazed sniper dealing death from a tall public structure would soon be repeated in January of 1973 at a Howard Johnson's Motor Lodge in New Orleans. Mark James Essex had grown up in Emporia, Kansas, and had a history of defying authority. In 1971, he was discharged from the Navy for character and behavior disorders. He then drifted to New Orleans to visit a militant friend. There, he focused his feelings of hatred for white society and covered his bedroom walls with fierce, revolutionary slogans. For the young and antisocial Jimmy Essex, the bloody revolution would come on January the 8th, 1973. While fleeing from police after a grocery store holdup, the heavily armed bandit darted into a local motor lodge and frantically blasted his way to the top floors. There he started a series of fires and proceeded to the roof, where he began a full assault on the firemen and police officers who had gathered below. So swift and deadly was his barrage that to this day, theories abound that Essex was actually commanding an entire squad of snipers who somehow eluded capture. Throughout the 27-hour siege, police sharpshooters couldn't draw a bead on the busy sniper, who seemed to be everywhere at once, picking off patrolmen and firemen with relative ease. As a desperate last measure, a military helicopter was loaded with the city's best marksmen and dispatched to the scene to directly challenge the killer at close range. As the chopper closed in, Essex could be heard verbally taunting his foes. Yet after an intense volley from the airship's crew, the gunman fled from his cover and expired in a hail of bullets. In the wake of the ordeal, 3 New Orleans police officers were fatally shot and 4 others wounded. 4 hotel guests and employees had also been slain, and a total of 21 firemen and bystanders were injured during the melee. Days later, the body of the 23-year-old mass murderer was returned to his native Kansas, where family members registered shock and dismay at the violent deeds of restless, wayward Jimmy Essex. A decade later, inner rage once again prompted a mass killing when world-weary James Oliver Huberty reached his breaking point. When the 41-year-old factory worker was fired from a San Diego plant, he became deeply depressed. On July 18, 1984, Huberty gathered a portion of his gun collection and calmly informed his wife, "I'm going hunting for humans." He then walked to a nearby McDonald's and began a senseless slaughter of the restaurant's patrons. For over an hour, Huberty directed his lethal fire at anything that moved. Among the dead and injured were many children, whose bodies lay scattered throughout the parking lot. Once a SWAT unit and ambulances arrived at the scene, police quickly sealed the area and surrounded the building. Inside, Huberty paced the dining room, searching for a sign of life in the victims at his feet. Suddenly, a bullet from a sharpshooter's rifle struck the murderous madman and he dropped to the floor. His bloody reign of terror had ended as suddenly as it had begun. James Huberty's sudden impulse to go hunting for humans resulted in the nation's largest mass shooting to that date, in which 21 persons died and 19 were wounded. Due to the unprecedented degree of horror and grief associated with the location, the restaurant was eventually torn down and a memorial was erected at the site. Due to the stress and frustration caused by the ever-increasing complexity of our times, incidents of mass murder are currently on the rise. An equally alarming trend is the fast-growing phenomenon of serial murder, in which a compulsive killer claims his individual victims in a systematic fashion over a period of time. Such was the case of Juan Vallejo Corona, who illegally immigrated to the United States from Mexico in the late 1940s. Although he managed to establish a lucrative business as a farm labor contractor in Yuba City, California, Corona was prone to occasional displays of schizophrenic behavior. His talent for supplying area fruit orchards with scores of eager field hands was well known, although many of the work details were comprised of faceless drifters gathered from the alleys and Skid Row saloons of nearby Marysville. In May of 1971, the remains of a murdered migrant worker were discovered in a hastily prepared grave near the Feather River. A more thorough search of the area turned up body after body, until a total of 25 were uncovered. When investigators determined that a number of the victims had last been seen working for Corona, and when the pocket of one corpse yielded a pay voucher bearing his signature, the 27-year-old suspect was arrested. Autopsies of the victims revealed that, in addition to fatal knife and machete wounds, the bodies bore distinct evidence of homosexual assault. Corona was found guilty in 1973 and received 25 consecutive life sentences. While in prison, Corona would himself fall prey to a brutal knife attack by fellow inmates, which left him blind in one eye. In the decade following the capture of Juan Corona, homosexual lust would be a prime element in other sensational murder cases. In 1973, in Houston, Texas, 17-year-old Elmer Wayne Henley surrendered to police after murdering ex-serviceman Dean Allen Corll. Henley then directed authorities to the buried remains of 27 teenage boys and gave a startling, detailed account of how the sadistic Corll had ritually tortured and murdered each. After repeated evenings of glue sniffing and casual sex, Henley became a virtual slave to the monstrous Corll and was promised a cash reward for any young man he could lure to Corll's bedroom. The devoted youth would come to serve as a ghoulish Pied Piper, coaxing a steady stream of both strangers and neighborhood friends to Corll's makeshift Chamber of Horrors. thereby leaving anguished parents to speculate as to the whereabouts of each missing child. However, during one evening of debauchery, tempers flared and Carl physically threatened his young accomplice. Henley responded by fatally shooting Dean Carl and promptly turned himself over to police. He received a life sentence for his confessed role in the grisly series of Houston murders. In May of 1981 in Atlanta, Georgia, a suspect in a similar case that had perplexed police and outraged citizens for a full 2 years was finally taken into custody. A rash of methodical strangulations aimed primarily at young black males had claimed 28 victims and raised fears of a racist conspiracy in the minority community. 23-year-old media technician Wayne B. Williams was arrested after having been seen stopping in a freeway bridge the night the killer's final victim was dumped into the river below. Although the murder suddenly ceased with the arrest of Williams, he continually protested his innocence. However, the suspect's history of unusual behavior, coupled with incriminating fiber evidence gathered by forensic experts, resulted in his conviction and a sentence of 2 consecutive life terms. The most celebrated case of a single serial killer terrorizing a major American city began in July of 1976 in New York. David Berkowitz, a deranged recluse, suddenly initiated a year-long campaign of random shootings, which left 6 dead and several others wounded. The crazed gunman stalked his victims only at night, selecting courting couples as his primary target. It became clear that the killings were linked when police found a taunting note at the scene of one attack, which promised more mayhem and bore the signature of Son of Sam. On July 31st, 1977, Berkowitz approached a couple in a parked car and squeezed off 4 shots, killing Stacy Moskowitz and severely wounding her date, Robert Violante. A neighborhood resident witnessed him fleeing the scene in a car that had just been issued a parking ticket. The citation was traced to Berkowitz, who surrendered peacefully. His fixed grin initially led police to believe that their suspect was retarded. The killer stated that he was driven to kill by demons. One had taken the form of a neighbor's dog owned by a man named Sam Carr, thus providing the neurotic slayer with his now famous pseudonym. On August 23, 1977, Berkowitz pled guilty to the Son of Sam murders and received a sentence of 365 years. Of all the serial killers to date, perhaps the most prolific is Henry Lee Lucas. When granted parole for the 1960 slaying of his mother, an abusive alcoholic and prostitute, Lucas protested, stating that he feared he may someday kill again. Over the next decade, he did just that. And if his own accounting is accurate, Lucas may be responsible for the violent murders of hundreds of persons nationwide. Due to the particularly unnatural aspects of his upbringing, Henry Lee developed a deep-seated hatred for his fellow man. A compulsive desire to kill strangers, especially women, had taken root by the time he reached puberty. When the restless Lucas eventually took to the highway, he found he could freely engage in the one activity that brought him emotional release: random, merciless murder. Occasionally he was joined in this pursuit by another disaffected drifter he met in a Florida soup kitchen, a homosexual arsonist named Otis Toole. So fierce was Lucas' appetite for killing that even Toole's 14-year-old niece, Becky Powell, would wind up butchered and left in a desert. In 1983, the ex-felon was apprehended in Stoneburg, Texas, for illegal possession of a handgun. While detained, he shocked jailers by suddenly confessing to a seemingly endless array of grisly murders. When he implicated his one-time traveling companion, Otis Toole, who was serving a sentence in Florida for arson, Toole casually chimed in with his own ghastly series of revelations, some of which involved child killing and cannibalism. Although the credibility factor of both inmates' claims varied widely, investigators determined that at least 100 of the unsolved murders on record could indeed have been the individual and collective work of the gruesome pair. Lucas eventually received a death sentence for one murder that authorities were certain he committed, that of an unidentified female hitchhiker found nude and strangled in 1979. In November of 1990, Henry Lee Lucas was scheduled for execution, but received a last-minute reprieve. Only months prior, a controversial feature film based on his grim exploits became an instant sensation. Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer, paints a suitably graphic and unglamorous picture of a psychotic drifter. Yet even the most horrific of modern Hollywood dramas can't effectively depict the various levels of pain or gauge the true depths of every wound inflicted by that particular brand of menace known as the mass murderer.